Just take a look at this. It's a quiet little stream, right? Just making its way from the mountains down to the bay. It's peaceful. It feels like it's a world away from all the digital noise of our everyday lives. But there's another name that you see every single day. A name so common, it's pretty much a verb now. A name that basically defines what modern creativity is. I mean, think about it. Whether you're touching up a photo in Photoshop, maybe designing a logo in Illustrator, or even just opening a PDF, you are in this company's world. It's just part of how we do things now, right? We see it so often, we never even stop to think about it. It kind of sounds Southwestern, maybe, something to do with design or architecture. But the real story is, well, it's way more specific, a lot more personal, and honestly, a lot more natural. That's right. The huge global software company, the engine of the entire creative industry, is named after this little stream, Adobe Creek, that ran right behind the co-founder's house. So to figure out how that happened, we've got to follow the current. So here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to start with the creek itself. Then we'll meet the two guys who saw this revolution coming. We'll follow them to the garage where it all started, and then we'll see how that tiny idea blew up into a global powerhouse. And finally, we'll see why that simple name means so much. Okay, so first things first, let's get to know the place that started it all. You know, this wasn't just some random ditch. Adobe Creek has a really rich history all its own. So the creek runs for about 14 miles. It starts its journey way up in the Santa Cruz Mountains, in the steep, tree-covered slopes of Black Mountain. But then, as it comes down, its whole personality changes. It starts meandering through the super-urbanized valley floor of places like Los Altos and Mountain View before it finally empties into the San Francisco Bay. And this thing isn't just a single stream. No way. It's this whole complex system, fed by a network of other little tributaries. It's all these smaller forks and creeks that really give Adobe Creek its life, its strength, and its constant flow, which means it had water in it all year round. In this little quote gives us a peek into a world that's basically gone now. Before Silicon Valley really exploded after the war, this creek was so healthy it was a spawning ground for steelhead trout. We're talking about fish that swim all the way from the ocean to freshwater to lay their eggs. Seeing them there is a sign of a really pristine waterway, a world that's mostly just been paved over. And what about the name itself? Well, it's got its own story. The creek was actually named by a Spanish commander, Juan Prado Mesa, who built his home nearby using, you guessed it, adobe bricks. The word comes from the Spanish, who got it from the Arabic al-tob, which just means the brick. So it's a word about building, about creating foundations, and that theme is going to become really important in a. And that whole idea of building, well, it brings us to the two guys who started it all, the architects of our digital world. So on one side, you've got John Warnock, this visual mathematician who solved one of the biggest problems in early computer graphics. And on the other, you have Chuck Geschke, the principled engineer who put together the lab that would, well, change everything. They met at the legendary Xerox PARC, and this is the key part, John Warnock lived in a house in Los Altos whose backyard literally ran right down to the banks of Adobe Creek. So together at Xerox, they were tackling this massive problem. See, back then, trying to get what you saw on your computer screen to print out correctly was a total nightmare. Their solution was this language they called Interpress, and it was revolutionary. Instead of just sending a bunch of pixels to the printer, it mathematically described the page, which meant it could be printed perfectly on any device. It was true device independence. But Xerox, in what's become one of the most famous stories of corporate fumbling, just didn't get what they had. They saw it as like a minor feature, not the game-changing universal standard it was. So, frustrated but totally convinced they were right, Warnock and Geschke walked away from their comfy jobs to bet on themselves. They had to go it alone. And this is where we get to that classic Silicon Valley founding moment. But this one is tied to a very specific place, connecting this abstract world of computer code to the real physical world of a suburban backyard. So in December of 1982, they officially started their company in John Warnock's garage. And they named it Adobe Systems after the creek that was flowing just a few feet away. In that garage, they rewrote Interpress into an even better language they called PostScript. And almost right away, they got a visitor who knew a revolution when he saw one, Steve Jobs. So what was this $5 million for? It wasn't an investment. Oh no, this was Steve Jobs' offer to buy the entire company, lock, stock, and barrel.
$5 million for a company that was only a few weeks old and was literally operating out of a garage. They said no, just no. They didn't see themselves as building a cool feature for someone else's product. They truly believed they were building a company that could stand on its own 2 feet, a company that was going to define the future of how we all communicate.
So instead of selling out, they struck a deal. They sold Apple a 19% stake and licensed PostScript to them. Jobs was so eager to make his new LaserWriter printer a killer device that he paid this huge premium. And that single deal gave Adobe all the cash they needed and, unbelievably, made them the first company in Silicon Valley history to be profitable in its very first year. And with that foundation totally secure, the little company that started by the creek began a journey that would end up transforming not just publishing, but photography, design, and, well, the entire internet. What happened next is just a staggering run of innovation. In '84, PostScript kicks off the desktop publishing revolution. A few years later, '87, Illustrator comes out, defining what vector graphics would be for decades. In 1990, they buy and release a little program called Photoshop, which, completely changes digital imaging forever. Then in '93, they solve the problem of sharing documents with the PDF. A decade after that, they buy their biggest rival, Macromedia, absorbing tools like Flash. And then, in 2013, they make that huge pivot to the subscription-based Creative Cloud, locking in their dominance for a whole new generation. So let's bring this all back to where we started. Back to that creek. Why does this simple geographical name still hold so much meaning? It's because the name Adobe is actually the perfect summary of their entire origin story. It's like a triple entendre. First, it represents the material, right? The Adobe brick, a perfect metaphor for the foundational building blocks of software they were creating. Second, it's about geography, grounding this abstract digital company in the actual soil of Silicon Valley. And third, it's about domesticity, a little reminder that this global giant started in a home, in a garage, with a logo that was designed by John Warnock's wife, Marva. It really makes you wonder. We're surrounded by these brands and logos every single day, but behind them are these incredible stories of people and places and just random decisions that ended up changing the world. So that brings us to our question for you. What other famous companies do you know that have a surprising story behind their name? Let us know your favorites down in the comments. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. If you enjoyed digging into this story, please be sure to like this one and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives. We'll see you next time.